This is my land. You can't just build here. Those were the first words out of my mouth the day I realized the Homeowners Association had gone way too far. Welcome back to Try Next HOA Stories, where today's tale is about arrogance, betrayal, and a flood of revenge so wild it feels straight out of a movie. It all began on a morning that seemed perfectly normal. I walked out onto my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, breathing in the crisp silence of the countryside. My property had always been my escape, a quiet stretch of land passed down through my family, where I could enjoy peace away from the chaos of city life. But that calm didn't last long. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed movement in the distance. Men in bright orange vests were scattered across my field. Clipboards in hand, they strode with authority, hammering wooden stakes into ground, tying off markers with neon tape, and mapping out lines as if they owned the place. My stomach dropped. None of them had asked permission to be there. And worse, they acted like my presence didn't matter. I stormed toward them and demanded, "What's going on here? This is private property." One man, without even looking up from his clipboard, smirked and said casually, "The HOA approved this project, sir. It's all legal." That one word, legal, hit me like a slap. How could it be legal? I had the deed to this land sitting in a safe inside my house. My name was on the property line. This wasn't community space, and it definitely wasn't some playground for the HOA to do whatever it pleased. But when I pressed them, they ignored me. A few laughed under their breath, muttering things like, "Just another guy who doesn't understand how progress works." I walked away that morning with my blood boiling, but I had no idea how much worse it would get. Within weeks, the peaceful sound of birds and wind through the trees was replaced with the roar of bulldozers and the pounding of hammers. My mornings became unbearable, engines revving, machines digging, crews yelling orders. And before I could even process what was happening, my land was gone. Not physically gone, of course, but taken, stolen. My once wide-open property was transformed into a busy construction zone. By the time the dust settled, 35 shiny new homes stood proudly on my soil. I remember the first time I drove past after the last house was built. It looked like a whole new neighborhood had sprouted overnight. Families were unloading moving trucks. Kids were running around, laughing and playing in their brand new yards. Some people even waved at me like I was just some passerby. But inside, my stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't their land. This wasn't the HOA's neighborhood. This was mine. And yet, the more I tried to fight it, the more powerless I felt. I confronted the HOA president face to face. I'll never forget the smug look on his face as he crossed his arms and said, "This is community property now. You have no say." No say. The words echoed in my head like poison. I, the rightful owner, was being told to stand aside and watch as strangers claim my inheritance, my peace, my family's land. Neighbors, emboldened by the HOA's lies, even mocked me. One sneered, "Why don't you just sell and move on? The HOA knows what's best for the community." Another chuckled, "It's not like you were really using the land anyway." Even some of my so-called friends began to doubt me, whispering that maybe I was exaggerating. But deep down, I knew the truth. And more importantly, I knew something the HOA had overlooked. Because while they strutted around celebrating their shiny new neighborhood, they had completely forgotten about one thing: the dam. High above the development, nestled on the far edge of my property, was an old dam. Not just a little pond barrier or some decorative water feature. No, this was a decades-old water control system built by my grandfather himself. It had stood the test of time, holding back a massive reservoir of water that stretched for acres. And here's the critical part. That dam, legally and unquestionably, was mine. The HOA might have bullied their way onto my lower fields, but the reservoir and the dam, that was beyond their reach. I still remember the first time I climbed up to check on it after the houses were finished. The old concrete walls stood strong, moss creeping along the edges, with the sound of rushing water pressing against the gates. I ran my hand along the rusted metal lever, the release valve that could send the entire reservoir surging downhill in minutes. I chuckled to myself, not because I planned anything yet, but because of the irony. Here they were, building luxury homes in a valley directly below a dam they didn't even bother to ask about. And here I was, the man they tried to erase, holding the one car that could change everything. The HOA thought they had won, but they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. They thought I was just a low man shouting into wind, powerless against their lawyers, their money, their rules. But they have forgotten that sometimes the person you trample has more power than you realize. As I stared at the dam that evening, the sun dipping low and turning the reservoir golden, one thought burned brighter in my mind than all the others. They think they can steal from me, but I own the flood. And that was the moment I decided this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. At first, I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. I wasn't some hothead looking for payback. I believed in the system, in fairness, in the law. So I gathered every piece of evidence I had. My deed, the original purchase papers signed decades ago, tax receipts, even my grandfather's old notes about the property lines. And I marched straight into court. Walking through those tall courthouse doors, I felt a surge of hope. I was sure the judge would see the truth. I was sure the law would protect me. After all, what's the point of owning land if a piece of paper signed and sealed by the state means nothing? But the moment I looked across the courtroom, I knew this wasn't going to be the fair fight I imagined, because the HOA didn't come in like some neighborhood committee of volunteers. No, they came in like an army. Expensive suits, thick folders, lawyers with polished shoes and smug smirks, and their president, the same man who had told me I had no say, sat there with the confidence of someone who knew the deck was already stacked in his favor. I presented my case. I laid the documents down. I told the story of how the land had been in my family for generations. I explained how construction started without my permission. But every time I spoke, their lawyers were ready. They threw out terms like eminent domain, community zoning rights, HOA jurisdiction, things designed not just to confuse, but to wear me down. And the judge? Well, let's just say I didn't get the reassuring nods I was hoping for. Case delayed. Insufficient evidence for injunction. HOA jurisdiction applies. Those three phrases became the soundtrack of my life. Every time I filed a complaint, it bounced back stamped with the same cold denial. Every time I tried to push forward, the HOA's lawyers buried me in more paperwork, more fees, more legal nonsense. Meanwhile, while I drowned in red tape, construction didn't just continue. It accelerated. It was almost like they wanted to finish before the truth could catch up. Bulldozers roared day and night. Foundations were poured. Walls rose. And within months, the land I had grown up roaming, the same land where my grandfather had taught me to fish, to hunt, to respect the earth, was covered in cul-de-sacs and white picket fences. The insult didn't end there. By the time I dragged myself back into court, the neighborhood wasn't just finished. It was thriving. Families had moved in. Children were riding bikes down streets that, months ago, were still my fields. The HOA hosted barbecues and block parties, waving banners about community growth. And me? I was the outcast. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at me now laughed openly. Some even mocked me to my face. "Why don't you just sell and move on?" one of them sneered. "The HOA knows what's best for the community," another said with a smirk that made my fist clench. It wasn't just strangers either. My so-called friends, people who had once stood by me, began to doubt. They whispered behind my back that maybe I was exaggerating, maybe I was clinging to the past, maybe the HOA was right after all. But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong. And late at night, when no one was watching, I'd walk to the far edge of my property, to the dam. Now, let me be clear. This wasn't some little garden pond or decorative water feature. This was a massive, decades-old water control system. My grandfather had built with his own two hands, hauling stone and concrete up the ridge to hold back an entire reservoir. I grew up hearing stories about that dam. To my family, it wasn't just a wall of concrete. It was a symbol, a reminder of hard work, of self-reliance, of ownership. It had survived storms, floods, and decades where always standing strong. And legally, that dam was mine. Every brick, every bolt, every drop of water behind it. I'd stand there sometimes in the moonlight, listening to the deep rumble of thousands of gallons pressing against the barrier. The water surged and churned, restless, waiting behind the gates. And as I looked down the valley where 35 shiny homes now stood, I realized something important. The HOA might beat me in court. They might bury me in paperwork. Delay after delay, denial after denial. They might buy off judges, hire lawyers, and convince neighbors that I was nothing but a bitter old landowner standing in the way of progress. But there was one thing they could never take from me. The dam. Standing there in the dark, hand resting on the rusted lever, I felt a strange kind of calm. Because no matter how much they mocked me, no matter how much they dismissed me, no matter how many times the system failed me, I still had the ultimate reminder of who really controlled this land. The HOA thought they owned the valley, but they had built their shiny neighborhood in the shadow of something far older, far stronger, and far more dangerous than they realized. And it belonged to me. That night, as I walked back down from the ridge, I wasn't thinking about lawyers or paperwork anymore. I was thinking about water, and the truth hit me like lightning. They might win every battle in court, but the war, that was still mine to fight. Because I didn't just own the land. I owned the flood. The arrogance of the HOA didn't just grow, it exploded. At first, they acted like I was just a minor inconvenience, a stubborn landowner who would eventually cave. But when I kept resisting, when I refused to bow down, they shifted gears. They wanted to break me completely. And then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the HOA's logo like it was some kind of government seal. Inside, neatly typed in official language, was a bill demanding that I pay community fees. Not for my property, not for my home, but for the 35 houses they had illegally built on my land. Let that sink in for a second. I was being told to fund the theft of my own land. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because I thought maybe I had lost my mind. But no, it was there in black and white. They weren't satisfied with stealing. Now, they wanted me to bankroll their little kingdom. The fury that boiled in my chest in that moment is something I'll never forget. My hands trembled as I held the paper. I wanted to march right into their office and slam the letter down on the president's desk. Instead, I did what any rational man would do. I ignored it. I wasn't about to pay a single cent. But ignoring the HOA never makes them go away. No, it just makes them come at you harder. Within a week, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't a bill. It was a warning. They threatened me with fines. They threatened me with liens against my property. And then came the most outrageous claim of all. They warned that if I didn't comply, they could evict me from my own land. Evict me from the property that had been in my family for generations. From the soil where my grandfather built the dam with his bare hands. From the home I had maintained with blood, sweat, and tears. That was the moment everything clicked. The HOA didn't just want my land. They wanted me gone. I wasn't just a landowner to them. I was a problem, an obstacle, a reminder that what they had built wasn't entirely theirs. As long as I was still standing on that ridge, as long as I still had the dam, they could never fully erase the truth, and that terrified them. But instead of fear, all I felt was resolve, because if they thought they could erase me, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The final straw didn't come in a courtroom. It didn't come in the form of legal papers. It came at a block party. I was walking past one evening, keeping my head low, when I heard it. The thump of loud music, the smell of barbecue, the sound of kids laughing and neighbors cheering. And in the middle of it all stood the HOA president. He had a drink in his hand, his tie loosened, his smug face glowing under the string lights. He was holding court, surrounded by his loyal subjects, bragging like a king who thought himself untouchable. I slowed my steps, staying just close enough to hear. And then I caught the words that burned themselves into my memory. "That old man will give up soon," he said, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. "He's nothing compared to us." And then the laughter, the cruel, mocking laughter of 30 neighbors who didn't care that every one of their houses stood on stolen ground. They laughed like I was a joke, like my fight was over, like I was already defeated. And that's when something inside me shifted. Up until then, I'd been trying to play fair. I'd trusted the courts. I'd hoped for justice. I'd tried to be patient, even as my land was stripped away piece by piece. But in that moment, hearing their laughter, seeing their smug faces, something hardened inside me. I realized I wasn't dealing with neighbors. I wasn't dealing with a community. I was dealing with predators. And predators only understand one thing: power. I walked away from that block party without saying a word. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't let them see the storm that was brewing inside me. But as I made my way back up the ridge, past the houses, past the fences, past the driveways they had poured without my permission, I felt it. The pull of the dam, the weight of the water pressing against the wall, the quiet, steady hum of the flood waiting to be released. They thought I was powerless. They thought paperwork and politics had stripped me of everything. But they had forgotten about the one thing they couldn't touch. The dam was mine. And with that dam, I held more power in my hands than their entire committee, their lawyers, their judges, and their smug block parties combined. That night, as I stood once again at the top of the ridge, looking down at the glittering houses below, I made my decision. If they wanted to erase me, if they wanted to treat me like nothing, if they wanted to laugh at me like I was already gone, then they were about to see just how wrong they were. I wasn't giving up. I wasn't backing down. And I wasn't in play fair anymore, because I had something far greater than a courtroom strategy. I had the flood. I didn't rush into it. People think revenge is an impulse, a hot flash of anger that makes you act without thinking. But that's not how it happened. For me, it was cold, careful, calculated, because I knew one thing. If I was going to strike back, it had to be in a way they couldn't ignore and couldn't undo. The dam wasn't broken. It wasn't some ticking time bomb waiting to collapse. It was strong, built by my grandfather's hands, maintained by mine. For decades, it stood as the quiet guardian of my land. And built into that dam was a simple mechanism, a release wheel. One turn, and the gates would open. One turn, and the water would flow. I wouldn't be breaking the law. I wouldn't be destroying anything. I would simply be using what was mine, the same way my grandfather had designed it to work. But in my heart, I knew it would be more than that. It would be a message. The day came after a heavy rainstorm. 2 nights straight. The skies had opened up, dumping everything they had into the reservoir. By the third morning, the water was swollen, restless, pressing against the dam like a caged animal begging to be released. That's when I knew it was time. I hiked up to the control station. The air was thick with mist, the roar of rushing water louder than the sound of my own footsteps. Every beat of my heart echoed in my ears, steady and sharp, like a drum calling me forward. When I reached the wheel, I placed both hands on it. Cold steel met my palms. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing, listening, feeling the weight of the decision. One turn. That's all it would take. I thought of the block party. Their laughter. The smug smile of the HOA president as he said I was nothing. I thought of the letter demanding I pay for their stolen homes. I thought of every delayed court date, every denied stamp, every friend who doubted me. And then I turned the wheel. At first, it was a whisper, just a trickle, sliding to the gates. But then it grew. The sound deepened, swelling, transforming into a roar so loud it shook the ground beneath my boots. The gates yawned open, and thousands of gallons surged forward, free at last. The water shot down the channel, a silver serpent racing toward the valley. Down below, the brand-new neighborhood didn't know what hit them. I could see it from the ridge, their shock, their panic. People dropped their barbecue tongs, their lawn chairs, their drinks. Neighbors who once laughed at me were now standing ankle-deep, then knee-deep, in muddy water that poured through their streets. Yard became swamps. Cars bobbed like toys in a bathtub. Patios cracked and crumbled as the earth beneath them shifted and washed away. And those shiny new homes, built so fast and smug on land that was never theirs, their foundations groaned, shuddering under the assault. The water carved channels right through their picture-perfect lawns, tearing down fences, drowning flower beds, and leaving behind nothing but mud and ruin. I saw the HOA president run outside, red-faced, his expensive shoes sinking into the mess. He screamed, waving his arms wildly, pointing up at me on the ridge. His voice was lost in the thunder of the water, but I didn't need to hear the words. I could imagine them. Stop him, stop him. But it was too late. The dam wasn't broken. It wasn't out of control. It was simply doing what it had always been built to do, relieve the pressure. And as the water kept flowing, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief, because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about reminding them and reminding myself of one undeniable truth. This land was mine. This dam was mine. This power was mine. They had thought I was powerless. They had thought I was nothing. But as the flood turned their perfect little neighborhood upside down, they finally understood. I wasn't gone. I wasn't erased. I was right here, standing above them, while everything they built on stolen ground washed away beneath their feet. And in that moment, I didn't say a word. I just watched, because sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. The HOA called it disaster. To them, it was an act of aggression, an attack on the community, a deliberate sabotage of property. They gathered what little pride they had left and marched straight to court, convinced they would bury me under lawsuits. But here's the thing about arrogance. It blinds you. They never stopped to think about what they were up against. They never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, I had prepared for this moment all along. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. Neighbors, reporters, even rival lawyers filled the benches, whispering rumors. Some expected me to lose everything. Others came hoping for spectacle. The HOA's attorney strutted in like a peacock, shuffling stacks of paperwork, ready to paint me as a reckless old man who had destroyed an entire neighborhood out of spite. He spoke with drama, waving his arms, his voice echoing in the chamber. Your Honor, this man deliberately released water that damaged dozens of homes, vehicles, and community property. We demand compensation, millions in damages, plus legal fees. The crowd murmured. Heads turned toward me, expecting panic, regret, maybe even shame. But I didn't flinch, because when my lawyer stood up, he only needed a single folder. No theatrics, no grand speeches, just facts. He walked to the front, placed the deed on the table, and spoke calmly. Your Honor, this is the original ownership document of the dam, signed and notarized decades ago. This man's grandfather built it. He inherited it, maintained it, and owns it fully. It is private property. The HOA never had jurisdiction, never sought easement rights, and never negotiated water control access. Furthermore, the mechanism was not damaged or altered. It was operated exactly as it was designed to be used, to release pressure after rainfall. This is not sabotage. This is not destruction. This is responsible land management, fully within his rights as the legal owner. He paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. Then he delivered the final blow. The water was his. The dam was his. And he chose to use what was his. Case closed. Silence. The HOA president fidgeted in his seat, red creeping up his neck. Their attorney scrambled, flipping through papers, trying to argue back. But the judge didn't take long. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the deed, the legal records, and then looked directly at me. This court finds no fault, he said firmly. Case dismissed. That gavel's crack was sweeter than any applause. The HOA's empire crumbled overnight. Insurance companies, furious at the mess and the technicality that the damage came from private, uncontrollable water rights, pulled out. They refused to cover the losses. Families who thought they had bought forever homes packed their things within months, unable to afford repairs, unwilling to live on land scarred and soaked. One by one, the shiny new houses turned into hollow shells. Lawns became weeds. Streets became ghostly quiet. What had once been the HOA's pride, their crown jewel of community, became a cautionary tale. As for the president, the man who once laughed at me, mocked me, and called me nothing, he resigned in disgrace, hounded by angry homeowners, shunned by his own board. Word spread that he moved 3 states away, leaving behind the wreckage of his ego. And me? I went home, back to my quiet property, The land that had always been mine. The flood had scarred it. Yes, there were muddy stretches, broken fences, and uprooted soil. But it was mine again. Walking the familiar trails, hearing the wind whistle across the dam, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had reminded them, and myself, of the truth. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their community. I didn't need their rules, fines, or fake authority. All I needed was what had been mine from the beginning. That's the thing people forget. Power doesn't always come from fighting harder or shouting louder. Sometimes, the greatest power lies in patience, in knowing when to act, and in trusting the strength of what you already hold. The HOA wanted to erase me. They thought I was powerless. But in the end, I didn't need to fight them on their terms. I just opened the floodgates, literally, and let nature, history, and truth do the talking. So the next time someone underestimates you, remember this story. Remember that silence, patience, and one well-timed action can speak louder than years of arguments. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't anger. It isn't violence. It isn't shouting at all. It's simply opening the gates and letting the truth rush forward unstoppable. This was Try Next HOA Stories. And if you think this tale was wild, just wait until you hear what's coming next.